Alright, so today we're going to be talking about the idea of evolution, and this is our unit 2. So, let's start. We have this guy named Hersey. He's back in 1700s, and he was French. So as you can see in his name, his full name is Georges Louis Leclerc, and people call him Comte de Buffon. So Buffon, if you translate to English, is buffoon. It's not really a nice word. So he likes thinking about humans and evolution, the idea of evolution. Evolution was never a word back then. So he was thinking about this belief. However, he didn't know what it was. So he went out into the nature and he collected stuff. You know, he's a traveler. He collected stuff and he collected rocks or what we call fossils, or potentially all of these rare plants and rare animals that normally you wouldn't see out there in the field. So people didn't understand him because this guy was a absolute, well, he wasn't a genius, but the idea of evolution wasn't common back then. So people call him a buffon or a buffoon because they didn't know what he was thinking. However, France was under a quite disclosed government in that period. So the French didn't really like the idea that, hey, you're thinking something different than the Bible. That's not good. We're gonna kick you out. We're gonna kick you out of the country. So, sorry. So he came up with the idea that humans and ape potentially have the common ancestor. So you will go out there and you look at a monkey, maybe in China, and you'll be like, "Hey, is that's your cousin right there?" And also he also suggested that the Earth was more than 6,000 years old. So both of his suggestions weren't validated at that time, and people didn't like believing other people. Those people they were religious. They had a belief. They wanted to believe in the Earth was 3,000 years old. God created humans and all of that. So people didn't believe him, obviously, because he came up with this such wild idea that didn't seem believable at all. So we're gonna talk about a rock guy. So what is a rock guy? So rock guys, in our sense, they collect rocks. They love rocks. So rocks, you call them rocks, but they're actually fossils. So Georges Cuvier, this guy came in the late 1700s to the early 1800s. So he was credited with the development of paleontology. So now you may be asking, hey, what is paleontology or whatever? So that is basically a study of essentially ancient lives from dinosaurs to historic animals or whatever, and all through fossils. So fossil evidence, it's something very interesting. It reviews how many organisms have died and how many organisms changed over the time and what our planet was actually like very, very long time ago. So this guy was studying into that. Well, did he study into it? Not really. He liked collecting it. So he liked these unique fossils. He didn't realize what it meant, but at least he knew that these were species. So he realized that there were species that existed before that no longer exist now. So he came up with the idea of catastrophism, is that some sort of major environmental disease or event or like a tornado, it wiped out the entire population of a certain species. So now they're gone. He wasn't completely right, but he wasn't completely wrong. Lyle. So Lyle is an interesting person. He came in the mid 1800s. So he came up with the idea that yes, this buffoon might be right. It is probably 6,000 years old. Um, the Earth is probably going under some constant slow change, and maybe we are all changing every single day and night, and we obviously know that. So, but however, they didn't have a vocabulary back then to classify it. So he called it uniformitarianism. So it's that we are changing uniformly at a constant rate every single second. However, that change is so small that we're no longer able to notice it at all. So essentially, people are be like, "Oh, we're not changing," but there is this little change. So Lamarck, he came up with the idea of changing characteristics. So he created a line of decent increase in complexity with perfection of the final idea. So he made an idea and he came up with an entire proof of it to show people that he's probably right. So one thing that he came up with is the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So organisms have these characteristics that obviously help them survive in their environment. For example, a tiger, it has sharp teeth because it needs to hunt people. It needs to hunt them down and eat them. A cheetah, on the other hand, it runs really fast. That's because its leg is able to stretch to this incredible angle. However, it was highly controversial because he came up with the idea that we're not changing, but we are able to acquire some trait and pass it on. So what was his proof? This was his proof. So at first we had a giraffe that didn't look like a giraffe, or even its neck was so short that you can call it a giraffe or a zebra essentially. However, it kept on reaching to higher leaps because all of its friends and families and cousins and its competitors, they were this tall. So they kept on eating, let's say they were 1 meter tall. They kept on eating leaves that were only 1 meter tall. So there was no more leaves at 1 meter tall. So suddenly this one little giraffe realized, hey, why am I eating all of these leaves so short? I'm gonna grow taller and reach higher. So now I can eat higher leaves. So he did that, obviously. And then he realized, oh, my neck got longer somehow. And then he reproduced and realized, oh wait, my children, they have the same long neck as I do. So they realize, oh my god, I'm using that trait, but if in some chances I'm also able to pass that trait. So we led to the guy Darwin. Now this guy, you've probably seen him all over your Instagram reels, but he's actually pretty important. He's a traveler and he's pretty old. So in the back in the days, people didn't care if you're knowledgeable or not. They looked at you and be like, "Hey, you're so young. You probably don't know. No, sorry, you probably don't know nothing." And then you look at it, oh man, oh my God, he's the wisest man ever. He must be a professor at like University of Toronto. He must be a professor at MIT. So you look at these old people and they become so respectable. So Darwin was one of these old people. He studied various animals in a lot of places. He worked for a museum, and he studied the work of other naturalists. And I mean, most people here, he all learned from them. He learned from everybody before him. So he was trying to come up with some sort of conclusion. You know, he was studying and then he's like concluding. So he was really smart, and he did come up with some conclusions. So he came up with some questions. But however, questions is always the first step to determine an answer if you ever took physics class. So why are similar organisms clustered in different regions? Why are organisms not randomly distributed? So in, let's say, I'm not saying I'm not dissing any religions, but in in some organisms, in some beliefs and religions, they believe that God created all of them, or to say that this holy creator or whatever, they created everything. And so he put these guys randomly distributed on the land. However, we realized after actually studying into ecology and animology or whatever, we realized that that's not true. The similar organisms are clustered in different regions that had similar habitats. And then we see, why do regions have living organisms that somewhat resemble the fossilized organisms? Why did the species on an isolated island resemble the closest coastline? How can such diversity exist in a small area? Could a system like artificial selection work in nature? So he came up with these questions that are extremely crucial to his development of what? Of survival of the fittest. However, this was not only his contribution. It also had a contribution of this guy, Malthus. So Darwin knew populations. It was changing, but he didn't know how and why they were changing at all. So this guy, Thomas, he was actually an economist. So economists are funny. So I'm not going to talk about capitalism, but essentially he came up with the idea that populations was growing so fast that eventually we're going to starve. And there was not enough food for all of us. So we're going to start killing each other, and we're probably going to die. Now he was right to some extent. However, he was only an European. He was only European, and well, he was only in the Western nations, so he doesn't know that the world had such a big landfill, and there was potentially other places in the world that produce food. But however, so he came up with the idea that we aren't able to sustain ourselves. We don't have enough food to survive all of us. So the population will eventually reduce itself, whether it's starvation or we're killing each other for food. And that led to the idea that the survival of the fittest. Organism with traits that's going to help them to survive will survive. And when they survive, they will get a chance to sexually reproduce. And when they sexually reproduce, they have a great chance of passing these obtained traits that help them survive, pass it to their offspring. Now, when is this needed? So, humans, we certainly don't have survival of the fittest, or we wouldn't even have all of these. Okay, never mind. So, humans, we don't have survival of the fittest because we don't have a limited resource. Yes, I get it, money is sacred, but and all of that, and you learn in economics probably, everything is sacred. All of these money and stuff, they're all sacred except for air. So, the thing is, it's sacred, but scarcity is a big factor when it comes to people that don't have money. Money is scarce. Money is also rare. It's a limited resource. However, when your parents have money, that no longer becomes a problem. So the idea of survival of the fittest no longer work for humans because we have such a developed system, and it's just not affecting us anymore. So, but back in the days, we didn't have this developed system. So if I was able to kill you, I'd probably get your food, and nobody even care about that. There was no law that's gonna sentence me death sentence or life sentence or whatever. So over times, these organisms that survived with this trait, they will live, and those that don't have that trait and they are not beneficial for the environment, they will die. So essentially, the ones that are good always live, and the ones that are bad that always dies. And so the ones that live are always good. So when you have these always good that reproduces, eventually everyone will become always good. Because the always bad just dies after one generation. But the always good, they keep on going. So they realized that somehow they were doing modifications to these evolutions. So maybe everybody's getting this trait. Suddenly, only a small percentage of them has this trait. But they realized that they didn't understand what was the direction, at least at that time. So we all came up with the origins of species. Darwin. So he came up, life from a common ancestor. And he came up with, as organisms move, adaptations are developed and proliferated to help them better survive. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. So essentially, I know the wording is pretty stupid. So to sum all of this up, is that organisms will compete for resources. However, only the better suited individual will survive. Organisms, when they survive, they will reproduce. However, when they reproduce, they produce more that can survive. So a good majority of what they reproduce or what their children is not going to live. 2 out of 5 probably, or 1 out of 5. So, however, even this 1 out of 5 kid, he probably has this inherited trait from his dad or his mom. And his mom, because they survived, so they had this good trait. So because his dad and his mom had this good trait, they're going to pass it to their children. And when their children gets this trait, they're going to survive. So essentially, we are still living. And they are still able to maintain this population, even though very least amount of them actually survive. And then he came up with the idea that process of change is actually very slow and gradual. So we can't notice a change this morning I wake up, and then tonight I sleep. I'm going to develop wings. Or I'm going to develop some sort of stuff that help me fly. No. It's going to take my entire lifetime for me to acquire this trait. And when I acquire this trait, if it's not on a sexual cell, I'm probably not going to pass it on. So it's only beneficial for me. That's the biggest problem. But however, people didn't like this idea at all. I know Darwin was a very respectable and old man and all that, but no, people didn't like the idea that they are given something that's not true, and it was true, but it conflicted with what they believed before. So people didn't like the idea of that. So, and Darwin understood that. Darwin was a smart man. He wasn't like buffoon who just published his ideas without caring about anyone. So Darwin was a smart guy. He kept these in a secret. He kept these. Essentially, he didn't want anybody knowing that he was thinking about this, because he would be the odd one out. Because everyone believed in a religion. They're like, oh, maybe God created all of us because God wants us to do this, blah blah blah. But Darwin believed that there was no God. That we are, well, he believed there was God, but he believed that there's actually sciences going on behind evolution, and it wasn't just plain God. So he kept this book that he wrote all in secret. And he came up and he even thought that he was going to burn it, because he think, oh my God, no one believes me. If I publish this book, people's gonna cuss at me, shut me out, and kick me out of this country. Until this guy came up, Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace. This guy was a genius, honestly. He was a little kid, and he came up, he read all of these books. He came up with the exact same conclusion as Darwin. However, there was, Darwin, he didn't just write this book out of nothing. He published stuff before. He was like, oh, species probably had this, that, and species probably did that, that. And then he wrote them all in a book. And that's his conclusion. However, Wallace read all of his publications, the ones that he did publish. And he came up and he thought so hard, he came up with the same conclusion as Darwin. So he wrote Darwin. He was like, hey, Darwin, I read all of your publications. I believe that you're true. I believe that all of these are true because I came up with the same conclusion. Hey, man, I know you're really wise and you're a very good, very respected elder in the field. Why don't you look at my conclusions? So he came up with the same conclusions as Darwin. But however, Darwin didn't publish this at the time yet. So when Darwin saw this letter, he was like, wait a minute, another guy came with the same conclusion? This cannot be it. He almost burned this. He took this out of his drawer and published it the second day. So this guy was actually the biggest and the smallest contributor because he did came up with the same conclusion. However, nobody knew about him. Well, we do now. So essentially, Darwin now published all that, and we all know Darwin. But unless you take biology, you probably don't know this guy. And that was the history of evolution.